Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode, Brian was working hard to get something going for the Beatles, both in finding them out of the club scene and in getting them a record deal. By the end of the video, an assistant for Decca Records was going to go to the Cavern to see the Beatles and report back to the main executives his thoughts on them. So let's see what happens today. Brian at this time was playing EMI against Decca, and 5 days before the executive was to arrive at the Cavern, he wrote a letter to EMI. Brian wrote to Mr. White that he was disappointed that he hadn't heard from him on the matter that they talked about last week. And Brian wrote that he was enthusiastic about the Beatles. Brian mentioned several persons who were going to go see the band, and he then mentioned Decca by name. Brian said that he mentioned it because if they could choose, it would be EMI. Brian then said these four boys, who are superb instrumentalists, also produce some exciting and pulsating vocals. They play mostly their own compositions, and one of the boys has written a song which I really believe to be the hottest material since Living Doll. He ended the letter by saying, in regards to the German contract, Brian thought if he pressed them on the German record company would be willing to negotiate on breaking the contract at an earlier date than stated. The letter Brian wrote crossed with a letter White had sent to Epstein dated December the 7th. White stated that he returned the original contract and included the contract that had been translated into English. He stated that he noticed the contract would soon expire, and White was going to ask their artist managers if they were interested in the group. He also stated that I think you should note that it's necessary to give 3 months' notice of termination before June 30th, 1962, if you are to obtain their services. He ended by saying, please feel assured that I will have the material assessed very carefully and will write to you again as soon as possible. White was getting negative response from the four house producers. Norrie Parmore thought that the Beatles record was all right, but he had the Shadows at the peak of their career, and he didn't really need another group like them. White then offered it to Walter Ridley, and he said the record was difficult to judge, especially when he asked to separate the backing group from the lead singer, and the sound didn't interest him. The third A&R man, Norman Newell, detected wasn't that much, and then Epstein's group sounded a bit like the Shadows, and he wouldn't want to compete in the house with Paramore. The fourth A&R man, George Martin, was on holiday, so White couldn't offer the record to him. Had he not been away, history might have taken a different course. The rejection of the Beatles by 3 of his colleagues may have colored his view. Brian probably thought he had overplayed his hand mentioning Decca because he received a letter from White stating that having played the record to the various A&R men, the group had talent, but they had sufficient groups of this type, and they were presently under contract, and it wouldn't be advisable for us to sign any further contracts of this nature at the present. He ended the letter by saying, please accept my sincere apologies, and also thanks for letting us have the opportunity of first refusal. I return the original German contract herewith, with best wishes for Christmas and the New Year. Yours sincerely, R.N. White. Now Brian felt he had big problems. He got a no from EMI, and also the complication of extracting the Beatles from a contract with Polydor Records. Their German record deal turned out to be a licensing arrangement to Polydor by a noted bandleader. Burt Camford Productions had signed the Beatles to a contract from July 1st, 1961, for 1 year, renewable for further periods of 1 year, and 4 songs would be recorded per year, and gave the German company world rights as well as exclusively for 10 years from the date of recording. The royalty was iron-fisted, 5% of the wholesale price. That meant the Beatles would only get 1% of the retail price. Brian wrote to the German company asking for the Beatles' freedom. Luckily, Camford was a fair man, a successful musician who didn't wish to stand in the way of the Beatles' possible success. He didn't want to spoil the chance of the group to get recording contracts elsewhere. He did tell Brian he thought they should have the chance to make recordings with the group for the Polydor label while they were in Hamburg. The trade-off was simply that when the Beatles visited Hamburg in 1962, they would make records for Camford Polydor to complete their commitments in Germany. Epstein, relieved, agreed. Now they could proceed to a record deal. Now all hopes were on the visit of Mike Smith from Decca and his Cavern visit. December 13th, 1961, With enormous local excitement, Mike Smith went to Liverpool. He was taken to dinner by Brian Epstein, and at the Cavern he was mightily impressed by the Beatles' performance. And Brian was thrilled. Smith invited the Beatles to the London audition on New Year's Day, 1962. Brian felt that they were on the first rung of a ladder to the top. In London, Brian visited his Aunt Frida and stayed overnight with her. The Beatles stayed at the Royal Hotel, Woburn Place. The next morning, they made their way through snow and ice to Decca. They were right on time for the 11 a.m. appointment, but Mike Smith was late. So this upset Brian, who was always punctual. He thought it was an inferior treatment. The audition was uneventful. The Beatles reluctantly listened to Brian when he suggested that they play it safe, doing melodic ballads. John Lennon thought that they should do their usual Cavern act with a strong dose of rock and roll. They conceded to Brian's knowledge of salesmanship. Brian got so busy trying to manage the Beatles, it was taking over his record shop work. Brian's father was alarmed at the involvement Brian had with the Beatles. He confronted Brian several times, saying, "Do you know what you're doing?" Alistair Taylor said that when Harry used to get uptight, and he felt that Brian was neglecting the business, which he wasn't, according to Alistair. Queenie over drinks said to Brian's friend Jeffrey Ellis, when Brian left the room, she said, Brian said to me, the Beatles were going to be bigger than Elvis Presley. Isn't it ridiculous? But we got to let him get it out of his system. The men of Decca saw no reason to be rushing, deciding to move ahead with the Epstein's Beatles. Dick Rowe kept Epstein waiting for several weeks, which was agonizing for Brian and the Beatles. Brian finally got a phone call from Beecher Stevens inviting him to London. Brian didn't have his hopes up. Dick Rowe and Beecher Stevens again took Brian to lunch in their 7th floor Albert Embankment Executive Club, the date February 6, 1962. Over coffee, Rowe reached the subject of their rejection of the Beatles. He said, not to mince words, "Mr. Epstein, we don't like your boys' sound. Groups are out. 4-piece groups with guitars particularly are finished." Brian was angry. He said, "You must be out of your minds. You get these boys on TV and you'll have an explosion. They will be bigger and better than the Shadows. I'm completely confident that one day they'll be bigger than Elvis Presley." So this was sheer heresy. Presley Records distributed by Decca, but for Brian to line up an unknown Liverpool group alongside the king of rock and roll confirmed to these show business veterans that Epstein had lost his balance. They told him, "You have a good record business in Liverpool. Stick to that." That's what Dick Rowe advised. Epstein said he would prove them wrong because the Beatles were very special, the best in Liverpool, where competition was intense. The Decca people didn't want to send Brian away empty-handed because Brian was an influential voice among retailers nationally. So Rose said, "I have an idea. You know who might help you? Tony Meehan. He's a former drummer with the Shadows, but he was now making a name as a Decca artist manager." Epstein thought, well, that was something, so he stayed overnight in London. Brian found out, though, that he would have to pay £100 for the benefit of Meehan's advice on making a Beatle record. Brian was aggravated by Decca's rejection of the audition tape. Now he felt he had been treated condescendingly. To Brian, things started to look bleak. He didn't look forward to telling the Beatles the news. When Brian got back to London, he decided not to take the offer of Meehan's services. It was clear that Decca didn't favor the Beatles and that all their talk amounted to a dead end. And he wrote to Dick Rowe his decision. He said that he would decline Mr. Meehan's services. And Brian said the principal reason for the change of mind is that since I saw you, the group has received an offer of a recording contract from another company. But in the book, there's an asterisk, and it said that this wasn't true. Clearly an attempt by Epstein to make Decca men regret their coolness and change their minds. So this ended the Beatles' links with Decca, or so both sides thought at the moment. Within 2 years, EMI's production facilities were to become so stretched that Decca helped them out in a reciprocal arrangement to cope with the unprecedented demand for pressing Beatle records. So Brian at this time was in a jam. He was rejected by 2 major giants, EMI and Decca. He was glad he hadn't signed the management contract with the Beatles. At least, if he could not get them the big breaks, they were free to find another manager. When told about Decca's rejection, John Lennon said that they should never have listened to Epstein's advice on their choice of songs during the audition. It would be the last time he interfered with their music. Brian started to work on the Beatles' live appearance schedule. Next, he began the process of elevating their status by pressuring local promoters for improved treatment of the Beatles, plus higher fees. At the Antry Institute, where he received £15 fee in the kitchen in bagged coins, Brian was horrified. It was an insult to him and the Beatles. If he accepted such treatment, important artists should never be paid in ready cash. He wanted to be paid in a civilized manner in pound notes, and he stalked off in a huff, saying, "Send me a check." The message began to spread on the pop grapevine on Merseyside. The Beatles were being changed. His next step would be an incredible one. Well, I will stop the video here. In this video, Brian had two major record companies that he was trying to court. He tried his best, but both of them weren't interested in the Beatles. EMI had a group called the Shadows and didn't want to have competition with them. And Decca was blunt, telling Brian, "Mr. Epstein, we don't like your boy's sound. Groups are out, and four-piece groups with guitars particularly are finished." Brian was feeling deflated, and John Lennon didn't like it because Brian made them play ballads when they wanted to do rock and roll. He felt that's why they lost the recording contract. But Brian didn't give up. He started to change the way the Beatles were being treated, and he had more up his sleeve, as we're going to see in the next video. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. It will help my channel to continue to grow, and thank you everyone for all the support. I really appreciate it. As I said before, I created a list of merchandise from Amazon that I thought you might be interested in, and if you go on the link, it takes you to the Amazon page. If you purchase anything, I get a small commission that's of no extra cost to you. In the meantime, and more importantly, I wish everybody a great day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.